There is a close connection between the theme of violence and that of sacrifice. According to most definitions, a sacrifice, in contrast to an offering in general, requires that the offered object, a weapon, an animal, or a human being, is destroyed, which in the case of animals often means that the throat is slit and the body cooked, grilled, or burned whole, or driven into the desert with the prospect of certain death, as the scapegoat of Old Testament Judaism. The broader category of offerings, on the other hand, encompasses also incense rising to the heavens, the scattering of rose petals, libations of milk, water, and wine. Sacrifice undoubtedly revolves around the shedding of blood, the life force of the goat, sheep, or bull, partly or in toto given to the deity. As in Temple Judaism or the Old Norse religion, the prototypical sacrifice is that of an animal ceremoniously butchered, followed by a festive banquet or a simple meal. The uncanny resemblance with the killing of a human person is heightened when the animal victim fulfills a vicarious role in relation to the sacrifier, that is, the sponsor of the sacrifice, according to the sacrificial taxonomy of Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss. The victim then redeems the sacrificer from death. For a historian of religion, it is convenient to define sacrifices as a subgroup of offerings, with votive offerings as its extreme contrast. That is, gifts to the gods that become their possessions and are placed on sacred ground, for example within a temple precinct. Despite these differences, a sacrifice follows the basic structure of an offering, which establishes and maintains communication with the hidden world of the gods. Mostly an animal sacrifice is surrounded by non-bloody offerings of, for example, incense, fluids, and vegetarian substances. Implicit in most discourses on religion and violence is a political dimension, in which violence is seen as something to be circumscribed in order to maintain or recover peaceful coexistence between antagonistic groups and identities. But sacrifice is not simply an act of killing or a ritualized murder, but is a way to sacralize, regulate, and transform violence. That this process is sometimes destructive and run counter to universal rights and obligations is true, but sacrifice wedded to right reason highlights the question of necessary violence and its legitimacy. Sacrifice is therefore intimately connected to central ethical questions. The sacrificial mechanism is a kind of creative destruction. It sacrifices something of lesser value for a higher goal. It reinforces a hierarchy of values, prestige, and power. An animal is sacrificed to please a god, but also in order to provide food for a group of human persons. The sacrificial ritual often involves a sense of guilt and acts of reparation toward the animal species. It recognizes obligations and shows gratitude, for example, by returning the firstborn and the first fruits to the gods. The opposite of the sacrificial principle is found in the industrial handling of animals and in the mechanized, disenchanted business of modern warfare. Without a sacred space and sacred time of sacrifice, without the ethical recognition that the real sacrifice is of one's own self, for which one might put forward substitutes, the ethical dimension gives way to instrumental rationality that knows no boundaries but coolly calculates the most efficient methods of killing. The apotheosis of this mindset is, of course, the nuclear and hydrogen bombs, death, the destroyer of worlds. To analyze sacrificial traditions from the perspective of violence leads the researcher to a reflection on modernity, and thus the very context of the scholarly enterprise. The question is whether the modern age has in fact in any decisive sense transcended the long, violent prehistory of humankind? Or is there, beneath the surface of technological civilization, a deeper level of ferocious animality which has been molded by millennia of hunting and tribal warfare, and which was the driving force behind the later massive sacrificial cults of agrarian cultures, but also, as in the case of the Aztecs, the principle behind large-scale sacrifices of men and women? Are the devastating modern wars only the latest manifestations of these principles? The First World War was for many a brutal awakening to the realities of the sacrificial principle. The unprecedented scientific progress of the 19th century and the optimism accompanying it died in the trenches of northern France. The horrifying Holocaust, only 3 decades later, of mainly European Jews, reinforced the insight of the unlimited cruelty man is capable of. No sacrifice is too large or extreme. Such a concern with the destructive nature of man and the precarious prospects of modern civilization animated both René Girard and Walter Burkert, who published their seminal books on violence and sacrifice in the beginning of the 1970s. The scapegoat mechanism highlighted by Girard and the ritualization of the hunt with the necessary killing of the prey, which then turned into a sacrificial victim, are similar but different. Girard increasingly came to see Christianity and the death of the supremely innocent victim, Jesus Christ, as that which transcended the violent mechanism scapegoating and thus also sacrifice. Burkert, on the other hand, saw merely different attempts to conceal the violent nature of man with a thin cover of civilization, which probably would produce tragic results in the end. In this way, the anthropological reflection on the violent or basically peaceful nature of man is also a reflection on the prospects of modernity, the grand attempt to create a civilization without the help of the gods and without divine grace. However, this supposes that man is basically good, that at heart human persons are governed by constructive and socially beneficial instincts and principles. If the disorder of the human person is not only due to external factors, but proceeds from a deeper disruption or corruption, then it highlights a tragic nature of modern secular society, which ultimately rests on the basic goodness of human nature. Pure reason used with decadent motives produces institutions like Auschwitz, Gulag, and totalitarian surveillance states like that of present-day China. Anthropological and sociological theories probe the unconscious causes of sacrificial violence and its analogical phenomena in modern societies, as soldiers sacrificing themselves for the nation. For a religious person, however, sacrifice makes sense only when understood in its proper religious world. One can therefore investigate instead the meaning and role of concrete sacrifices, and sacrifice as an idea, a metaphor, covering also, for example, asceticism and self-denial in general. The role of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, or Ismail in Islam, as commanded by God in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is a central case. In fact, traditional Christianity is incomprehensible when the sacrificial death of Jesus on the cross is neglected as that which fulfills what the sacrifice of Isaac could not. The focus of such studies is then on the religious mind, the world created by ritual sacralization, by powerful creation narratives, and not primarily a focus on the precarious ethical program of liberal modernity. In this presentation, I do not have the time to do a thorough exegesis of the writings of Burkert and Girard, the most well-known scholars of sacrificial violence, or delineate the sacralization processes created by the religious mind, but my intention is instead to focus on the situated nature of scholarly reflections on sacrifice and violence, especially as it concerns human nature. If we at this graduate seminar discuss the ritualization of first fruit offerings, we can situate them in a pre-modern agrarian context, suitably distant from the urban setting of a typical research university. Or when analyzing jihadi martyrdom and acts of terrorism founded on a sacrificial ideology, we see ourselves as peering into the dark heart of religious fanaticism, which by definition is absent from the functionalist seminar room and its taken for granted human rights value foundation. But when linking sacrifice to violence, questions of human nature and civilization come to the fore as obviously the 20th century was not the most peaceful. Indeed, science and technology put the survival of the human race in question. We cannot therefore disregard that when linking sacrifice to violence, we also undermine the clear Enlightenment distinction between, on the one hand, religious pre-modern forms of thinking and societal formations, and on the other hand, modes of thought and social life flowing from the emancipated human reason. We are still violent. We still sacrifice our enemies. While writing this text, the collapse of the project of creating a liberal democracy in Afghanistan is unfolding, with a deadline only a few days off. And we still remember the dramatic spectacle of online executions performed by the ISIS in Iraq and North Africa, and the anniversary of September 11th is approaching. The scholarly reflection on sacrifice thus entails self-scrutiny. Ritual sacrificial violence is a mirror image in which we see ourselves more or less clearly and must pass ethical judgment on our deeds. Even if we take the position of many scholars of religious studies, a post-metaphysical stance of value neutrality and non-confessionality, and only report on the unvarnished truth of sacrificial violence, we cannot escape that with our proposal of truths about the human condition, we are also setting the parameters for possible forms of civilization. For Emil Durkan, the most prominent sociologist of the early 20th century, and a man who dealt prominently with religion, this interconnection of life and scholarship had tragic consequences. In his writings, he speculates and even promotes a future secular religion that has the sacred aura of the traditional metaphysical religions. For him, the gods are merely symbols of the social group itself, and therefore the religious acts, including sacrifice, are inflected towards society, which is the real God. For Durkan, individualism, that is liberalism, is not only a religion among many, but, quote, is henceforth the only system of beliefs which can ensure the moral unity of the country, end quote. He even states, quote, this is why man has become a god for man, and it is why he can no longer turn to other gods without being untrue to himself, end of quote. On February 21st, 1916, the Battle of Dardan began symbolically by that a German artillery grenade hit the cathedral that was built already in the 10th century. One more meaningless, extended slaughtering began, which in the end demanded up to 300,000 dead and 500,000 wounded. 4 days later, it was announced that André, Durkan's only son, had died. He was shot already in December 1915 at the Bulgarian front and died later by his wounds. Durkan cried, but made sure he was busy working. He wrote to a friend, quote, of course, I know that the religions are there, and that their practices are rich in experience that is unconscious and full of accumulated wisdom. But their wisdom is crude and empirical. Nothing resembling ritual practices has been of use to me or seems effective to me." End of quote. The nation had required its sacrifice, his only son, and the new religion, the cult of humanity, could not help him. Durkan never recovered, but became increasingly thin and feverish. Toward the end of 1916, when he left one of all these committee meetings for the French war effort, he had a stroke. He survived, but died a year later, and after another year, the war was over. In this seminar, we are connecting a Swedish scholar living and working in Norway with a graduate seminar in Sao Paulo, Brazil. All of us are affected by a global pandemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of men and women, and which has closed our societies in ways unimaginable only a few years ago, when globalization had an aura of irresistibility. My point with this talk is that when we begin to reflect on sacrifice and violence, we are also reflecting on our common humanity and the present situation. Is it tragic? Despite good intentions, flowery speeches and signed treaties, we have to sacrifice. Driven by the survival instinct, righteous intentions, or pure egoism, we shed blood. Peace is merely a fleeting moment, and with the arrival of crisis, hard principles come to the surface. The central question of the study of sacrifice in this self-reflective mode is whether we are capable to transcend our violent nature. Suppose ritual sacrifice is not only a reflection of necessary violence, as the hunt or butchering for eating animal flesh, but perhaps more accurately, it is a mechanism to transform instinctual, destructive principles. And in a second step, voluntary self-sacrifice, as found in ascetical movements, questions maximizing profit, pleasure, and power. In this way, sacrifice is crucial for any ethical stance that rejects egoism. But it can also be used for terrifying violence, as in terrorism. As for Durkan, Girard, and Burkert, our own theories of sacrifice has consequences for our life. A sacrifice is an act of communication with our gods. The Christian transcendent God, one of the many gods of Hinduism, or one of the modern gods, such as the nation. What is lower is sacrificed for what is higher. Sacrifice then not only puts ethical pressure on the individual, but also on the social group. If the sacrificial principle is in some way part of our human nature, fashioned throughout millennia, then it cannot simply be rejected as part of earlier stages of civilization, something we have outgrown. But we must come to terms with its ethical demand. In a sense, we are, as Durkan and Abraham, long before him, destined to live the terrifying prospect of a God requiring us to sacrifice our most valued possession, in this case our child, our future. Even a scholarly theory of sacrifice sets the scene for an answer to whether and how the sacrificial principle can be sublimated, transcended, or if we are simply helpless before its power. From ritual through ethics to civilization, sacrifice is a red thread of human history.